Hey everyone, if you're listening, you probably want to get up to speed on things quickly, but, actually understand them too.
Yeah, not just skim the surface.
Exactly. And that's what we're doing today. We're diving deep into some recent research and a really sharp critique of it.
It's a fascinating intersection, really. We're talking about a study that just came out in the Nordic Journal of Psychiatry,
Okay.
Davidsson and colleagues. They were looking into potential links between mothers' adverse childhood experiences, ACEs,
Right. ACE.
and neurodevelopmental conditions like ADHD and autism spectrum disorder in their
Okay.
children.
Okay. And that study got picked up, didn't it? I think I saw a headline.
It did. Neuroscience News ran a piece, and the headline was pretty stark. Mom's childhood trauma may influence kids with ADHD and ASD.
Oof. Yeah, you hear that and, well, it makes you pause, doesn't it?
It definitely made Dr. Jaime Hoerricks pause,
Uh-huh.
and they bring a really unique perspective here.
Tell us about that.
Well, Dr. Hoerricks chairs an institutional review board, an IRB,
Okay, so they know research ethic.
deeply. And also, they identify as AuDHD, that's autistic, and ADHD and alexithymic.
Wow. Okay, so lived experience and ethical oversight.
Exactly. And they wrote this really insightful critical reflection on the study and that headline. Their immediate reaction was one of discomfort.
Discomfort with the framing, you mean?
Yeah, that headline and just the general angle. Dr. Hoerricks felt it tapped into a really old and frankly harmful narrative.
Which is?
The tendency to blame mothers for their children's neurodivergence. It's like this ghost that keeps reappearing.
The refrigerator mother kind of idea, but maybe updated.
Precisely. Dr. Hoerricks specifically mentions Kanner's shadow, lingering Leo Kanner's long-debunked theory about cold mothers causing autism.
So even using terms like adverse childhood experiences, it still circles back to the mother being the primary cause, or at least the main focus.
That's the concern raised. The study zooms in on the mother's ACEs, her trauma history.
And what about other factors, like the father's experiences or the broader environment?
Very little attention paid to that in the study's focus, according to the critique. It sort of defaults back to the mother as a central, almost sole variable tied to the child's neurodevelopmental outcome.
That framing concern immediately makes you look closer at how they actually did the study, right? What were the methodological issues Dr. Hoerricks flagged?
This is where it gets really crucial. The biggest omission, from Dr. Hoerricks' perspective, is the complete lack of consideration for how neurodivergent individuals actually process memory and emotion.
Okay, break that down a bit.
Well, think about memory. Autistic memory can be very episodic, focused on details, maybe not the overarching emotional narrative a neurotypical person might construct.
Right.
And ADHD involves differences in time perception, which can make memories feel fragmented. Plus, emotional salience can work differently, sometimes strengthening memory, sometimes interfering.
And then alexithymia?
Yeah, which is common in both autism and ADHD. Difficulty identifying and describing emotions. How does that affect recalling and reporting on potentially traumatic emotional experiences asked about in an ACE's questionnaire?
So the tool itself, the standard ACE questionnaire, might be the problem here.
That's a core point. It was developed for and validated on neurotypical populations. Dr. Hoerricks asks, is it actually valid or reliable for autistic and ADHD individuals?
And the study doesn't provide evidence that it is.
No. It
Yeah.
seems to just assume it works the same way for everyone.
Which ignores the very real differences in memory you just mentioned.
Exactly. And relying on retrospective self-report, asking people to remember things from potentially long ago is already tricky.
Yeah, memory isn't perfect for anyone.
Right. But it's especially complex when you factor in neurocognitive style, potential trauma responses, altering recall, and developmental differences. These self-reports aren't just neutral data points.
And this leads back to the involvement piece, doesn't it? Dr. Hoerricks noted the lack of neurodivergent input in the study design.
A critical absence. There's no indication that autistic or ADHD individuals help shape the questions, review the methodology, or anything.
Which, from an IRB perspective, sounds like a major oversight.
Dr. Hoerricks definitely approaches it from that angle, too. Thinking like an IRB chair, what questions would they ask?
Okay, let's get into that ethical perspective. What are the key concerns there?
Well, first, that fundamental question we just touched on. Has the ACE questionnaire actually been validated for neurodivergent people? The study doesn't show it has. That's a big red flag for reliability.
Right. What else?
The failure to control for alexithymia. Given how significantly it impacts emotional memory and self-report, not accounting for it really undermines the study's claims about associations. How reliable are these connections if the reporting mechanism itself is potentially skewed?
That makes sense. Were there concerns about the participants' well-being too? Asking about trauma is sensitive?
Hugely sensitive. And Dr. Hoerricks points out a lack of apparent trauma-informed procedures. Meaning, was there any mention of monitoring participants' emotional state during the recall, offering real-time support, providing proper debriefing afterwards, especially for kids asked about difficult experiences?
And the study didn't detail any of that.
There's no mention of it, which is concerning when you're dealing with potentially distressing memories.
And then the study makes a recommendation based on these findings.
Yeah, it suggests implementing routine ACE screening in neurodevelopmental assessments.
But Dr. Hoerricks questions that.
Strongly questions it
Yeah.
because it ignores the risks. The risk of re-traumatization without proper support, the risk of misinterpreting responses due to neurodivergent communication or memory styles.
Or the risk of increased stigma if these screenings aren't handled very carefully and ethically.
Precisely. It leaps from a potentially flawed association to a clinical recommendation without fully considering the potential harms, especially for neurodivergent folks.
It really does seem crucial then to understand these different ways memory can work. You touched on it, but can we explore those memory landscapes a bit more? For autism first?
Sure. So, as Dr. Hoerricks describes, autistic memory can often be characterized by vivid recall of specific episodes, sometimes called episodic memory.
Like remembering exact details.
Often, yeah. Sensory details, factual information might be very prominent, maybe more so than the sort of synthesized emotional gist a neurotypical person might prioritize.
Interesting.
And the impact of how emotional an event was might be inconsistent. It doesn't always mean stronger recall. Also, there's often heightened memory for things that are personally relevant, focused on special interests or facts, rather than maybe social emotional events.
Okay. And how does ADHD impact memory differently?
With ADHD, a key factor is often the disrupted perception of time. This can lead to memories feeling kind of fragmented or maybe out of sequence, not a smooth timeline.
Right, I've heard that described.
And emotional salience plays a chaotic role. A highly emotional event might be burned into memory, or the emotion might actually interfere with encoding or recall.
So it's unpredictable.
It can be. And emotional overwhelm can impact working memory, which is needed to process and report on experiences coherently.
And then overlay alexithymia onto both of those.
Right. If you struggle to identify or label your own emotions, your memory of an event might be factually intact. You remember what happened, where, when, but it might lack that emotional color or significance that a neurotypical framework, like the ACE's questionnaire, often expects.
So asking, were you often afraid, might be really hard to answer accurately if you struggle to identify afraid internally.
Exactly. Or you might interpret the question based on external events rather than internal feeling states, which could lead to underreporting or reporting that seems flat to an outsider expecting a certain emotional response.
So using the standard ACE framework with AuDHD individuals, it's like a fundamental mismatch.
That's the argument Dr. Hoerricks makes. It's trying to measure something, using a tool not designed for the way that thing manifests in this group.
And the consequences of that mismatch.
It can lead to misinterpretations, seeing false patterns. You might interpret differences in how memory is stored, or emotions are processed as evidence of more or less adversity or different types of adversity than actually occurred.
And potentially blaming mothers based on these misinterpretations.
That's the danger. The link gets drawn between the mother's reported ACEs and the child's diagnosis. But the interpretation ignores that the mother's own neurodivergent traits might be influencing her recall and reporting through this neurotypical lens.
It's not just a methodological flaw then, it's deeper.
Dr. Hoerricks calls it an erasure of neurodivergent ways of remembering, feeling, and being. It imposes a neurotypical standard where it doesn't fit.
And the problem is these studies, even flawed ones, get amplified, right?
Oh, absolutely. Science news outlets pick them up, simplify them.
Like that headline we mentioned.
Exactly. And those simplified takeaways can quickly become accepted knowledge among clinicians, educators, even policymakers who don't have time to read the original paper or the critiques.
So flawed science can sort of filter into practice relatively easily.
It's a real risk. And that's why Dr. Hoerricks felt compelled to write this reflection, to inject that critical thinking, that accountability into the process of how we consume research findings.
It's a call for more careful interpretation.
Yes, and to see the bigger picture. Dr. Hoerricks connects these specific methodological and ethical issues to Well, to wider patterns of ableism.
How so?
By framing neurodevelopmental conditions alongside maternal trauma in this way, without fully accounting for neurodivergent experience, it can implicitly devalue neurodivergent lives. It subtly echoes older, harmful ideas, even eugenic thinking, where difference is seen as damage originating from the parent, usually the mother.
So framing trauma through that neurotypical lens and locating the problem in the mother's history, it perpetuates these damaging narratives.
That's the argument. It keeps alive the idea that neurodivergence is something caused by maternal deficit, rather than understanding it as a natural variation in human neurology.
And the knowledge to do better is out there about neurodivergent cognition.
Yes, that's a key frustration voiced in the critique. Research exists on autistic memory, on ADHD and time perception, on alexithymia. It's not a secret.
So the fact that it's not being applied in studies like this one suggests what?
Dr. Hoerricks suggests it indicates perhaps a lack of willingness to adapt, to genuinely understand and incorporate these differences into research design, a resistance to moving beyond established but potentially inappropriate methods.
So what's the path forward then? According to Dr. Hoerricks' reflection, how do we improve research in this area?
The core message is really about participation and partnership. Neurodivergent individuals need to be involved.
Not just as subjects being studied.
No, absolutely not. As architects of the research, as co-designers, as reviewers, as ethical stewards guiding the process.
So valuing lived experience as actual expertise.
Fundamentally, recognizing that lived experience isn't just anecdotal, it's crucial data for ensuring research is ethical, accurate, and actually relevant to the community being studied.
Moving beyond just describing people to what?
To dignifying them.
Yeah.
To honoring their full humanity. The critique ends on a powerful note, suggesting that continuing to study neurodivergent people without their genuine participation and leadership is a form of colonization. Wow. That's a strong statement.
It is. It's a call for research to be done with people, not on or about them without their meaningful input.
Okay, so wrapping this deep dive up, the main takeaway seems to be the critical importance of scrutinizing research, especially when it deals with potentially vulnerable populations like neurodivergent individuals and their families.
Absolutely. We need to be really aware of how assumptions baked into study design, like assuming neurotypical memory and emotional processing, can lead to flawed conclusions and potentially harmful interpretations.
That headline effect is powerful. It really is. And it highlights the need for caution and critical thinking before accepting findings, especially when they seem to reinforce old, problematic narratives.
So maybe a final thought for our listeners to chew on.
Yeah, perhaps consider this. If research methodologies can miss the mark so significantly by not accounting for cognitive diversity in this one area,
What other assumptions might be embedded in widely accepted findings across different fields?
exactly, whose experiences, whose ways of knowing and being might be systematically excluded or misinterpreted in the research we rely on.
It definitely encourages you to seek out diverse perspectives and question the universal applicability of findings.
Definitely, always ask, who was involved in creating this knowledge, and whose voices might still be missing?